arrival of Scottish Rite Theatre. That's the name of our topic tonight. This talk was originally given to the Lodge of Perfection in March the 14th of 2011. And so we're recreating this thing for the taping, but we'll go through the thing as it was given back in those days. In a couple of weeks, the McAllister Scottish Rite will begin phase 3 of our stage scenery restoration. So I thought it might be interesting to explore when and how the Scottish Rite got into the theater business in the first place, and needed, among other things, such scenery and backdrops and things like that. The restoration work is being accomplished by Wendy Wassett Barrett, a nice-looking middle-aged lady from Minnesota. She's got a doctor's degree in theater stagecraft, and she's an expert in an area of stage scenery and has recently concentrated her efforts with the Scottish Rite around over the country. In 2003, she presented a paper to the Scottish Rite Research Society on theatrical interpretations of the indispensable degrees. Now this is kind of unique to have a female, which means she obviously is a non-member, giving a lecture to the learned members of the Scottish Rite Research Society on what has become the heart of our order, but she knows her business. Using Masonic terminology, she is both an operative and a speculative expert on Masonic degrees and stagecraft. By this I mean she not only talks a good job, but she knows how to work and restore the scenery itself. I mention this because I have drawn extensively on her lecture for tonight's presentation. To begin this discussion, let's go back to last August and September, when we explored how and why we have two Masonic jurisdictions, the northern and the southern jurisdictions in the United States. As a quick review, you will recall that the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry was actually begun in 1801 in Charleston, South Carolina, with the writing of the Constitution creating the Supreme Council. However, another Supreme Council, though unauthorized, sprung up a few years later in New York State, and they called themselves the Northern Jurisdiction. Also, yet another competing group called the Cerno Group appeared in that same geographic area, the Northern geographic area. So Scottish Rite Masonry in the northern states was in a constant turmoil. They were battling one another, competing for candidates and so forth, while the southern jurisdiction didn't have that problem, and they just decided to stay out of that mess and concentrate on all of the new and emerging states as the country moved westward. So finally, after 50 years unrest, all of the northern factions finally consolidated in the year 1867, and thereafter have operated as one single northern jurisdiction. Currently, the northern jurisdiction covers the 15 states in the northeastern part of the country, and the southern jurisdiction has all the rest of them, all 35, including Alaska and Hawaii. This review of Masonic history was necessary because it has a bearing on our topic. The southern jurisdiction was very conservative in its degree work, and then with the arrival of Albert Pike, he adapted his revised degrees, and they were still quite conservative. He didn't add anything new, at least until Pike's death in 1891. So this was the southern jurisdiction's perspective on degrees, was that we're going to stick with basically what it was. We're going to update the wordage and so forth in the Pike changes, but as far as the actual changes, hardly anything. Now, because of the various groups and multiple leaders and so forth, the degrees of the northern jurisdiction were not so cast in concrete. The northern jurisdiction was willing to experiment and vary or update their degree work. One of the variations took place in the early 1860s. This was actually just immediately following the Civil War in Cincinnati. They began to experiment with certain degrees by changing from a lodge room setting to more of a theatrical type production. Of course, the meeting facilities did not have stages or auditoriums, so the presentations were made in what they called apartments, which were basically smaller rooms with permanently painted backdrop walls. And for instance, they would have one apartment with a painted outdoor scene, and numerous degrees were put on in that apartment. And then they'd have another one with an indoor or palace type scene, and so the appropriate degrees would take place in that background. The new approach seemed to receive approval of both the old-timers and the candidates in the northern jurisdiction. And since this took place before the 1867 Consolidation, when the northern jurisdiction finally got its act together and all went together, and competition for candidates was still quite strong, the temples adopting this new approach to degree presentation were winning the membership battles. And this was one of the reasons why they had a tendency to slide into the theatrical presentations. So from Cincinnati, this idea spread to Indianapolis and then to Chicago. As new buildings, all in the northern jurisdiction, as new buildings were constructed, they were much larger, incorporating a stage and an auditorium. And this is when stage scenery began to appear. Wendy's research reveals that one of the first theater firms to produce Masonic scenery was a Chicago firm named Saussman and Landis, and between 1883 and 1884 for new buildings in Indianapolis and Chicago. The term indispensable referred to a degree that was mandated to be conferred in full form, which meant on stage with costumes. Now we're still talking northern jurisdiction. This new theatrical concept was primarily confined to the northern jurisdiction for this period of 1860 to 1890. During these 30 years, the southern jurisdiction was under the firm control of Grand Commander Albert Pike, and he was not for the theater type presentation. Let me quote you a paragraph taken from a speech given by Pike in 1882, which will indicate his preferences in this regard. The rite in this jurisdiction is a rite of instruction and not of scenic pomp and stage show. We do not indulge in melodrama or pantomime. It is the firm conviction of hundreds of our zealous workers that our books are well worth being studied, and that the rite as developed in our degrees is destined by God to be in our future one of the chief benefactors of humanity. I cannot conceive of a more useless occupation than the arranging and performing of degrees, neither the effect nor the purpose of which is to make men wise or better, but which are acted out as melodramas, to gratify an aesthetic taste and please the imagination, like the pageantry of carnivals and orioles. It's just not necessary. Now that was Pike's perspective, so you could see, and the firm control he had on the southern jurisdictions, they were not getting into this theater stuff. These words, strong words from Pike, indicated his perception of this new degree presentation style. Pike felt that the degrees should be conferred slowly and in an instructional mode. There was listen to this, there was a mandatory interval between degrees for reflection and study as follows. Between the 14th and the 16th degrees, 3 months. 3 months time before you could take the next series. Between the 16th and the 18th, 3 months. Between the 18th and the 30th, 6 months. And between the 30th and the 32nd of the consistory, 1 year. Now you can see it takes a long period of time to become a 32nd degree Mason in the southern jurisdiction back in those days. But there was a whole lot of education going on during this time. So this required a minimum of a 2-year period to advance from the 4th through the 32nd degrees. The theater style of presentation was rarely used in the southern jurisdiction until after Pike's death in 1891. Thereafter, theater presentation did not creep in slowly in the southern jurisdiction. It exploded and spread rapidly throughout the Orients and the valleys. This is after Pike died. This has been the story of how the concept of theater entered the Scottish Rite. Historians say that you need to study the past to be able to chart a proper course for the future. If this is true, we might contemplate what message this scrap of history tells us. In this regard, 2 questions seem to pop up into my mind. The difference between professional stage presentations and amateur presentations, that is the acting, the costumes, the scenery, during the latter part of the 1800s was minimal. Now, 100 years later, the difference is monumental when you consider movies and television. There's a stark contrast between amateur and professional theater. So this prompts question number 1. Are we still getting the glitter and the attention of our candidates through our theater style presentation? Good question. Second question. In the process of moving to the theater style presentation, have we lost the instructional or teaching aspect that Albert Pike so cherished? These are philosophical questions that certainly this group is not going to answer, but it might be worth to ponder in years to come. Thank you for your time and attention.